The world of business has changed, so we've changed everything with software-defined interconnection, reduced complexity, improved performance, greater flexibility, lower connectivity costs. All with a simple-to-use platform that makes this feel like this. Is effortless and fast, predictable and secure. It's self-provisioning, automated, spin-up connections and flex bandwidth on demand, and only pay for what you use. All this within a global community that shares, collaborates and grows together. Take control, cut complexity, make interconnecting effortless with Console Connect.
Aloha, this is Mahia Lenny with PTC. Thank you for joining us today for another session of PTC's webinar series, Frictionless Business, sponsored by PCCW Global. We now turn the time over to Kevin Vachon of MEF.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kevin Vachon. I'm the COO of MEF, and I'd like to welcome you to the today's webinar. I firstly want to thank PCCW and Marc for inviting me to participate. MEF and PCCW have been working together for many, many years, on the journey to network and service automation. And indeed, we've received very, strategic guidance from Marc and his team all along the way. Just to set the stage here a little bit, as we all know, as digital transformation plans gather pace, the ICT requirements of organizations are increasing in both scale and complexity. And so what we're going to explore today is the role that automation can play in uniting the ecosystem that is necessary to drive new value and efficiency for carriers and their enterprise customers. And I think the enterprise, the emphasis there is, the enterprise drivers. It's all about meeting their needs. And in particular, we're going to explore how network orchestration and APIs can help with the convergence of new network-centric technologies such as cloud, IoT, and edge computing. And we'll also check in as to where the carriers are in terms of working together and embrace whether they're embracing new standards, to drive intercarrier automation and so on and so forth. So we'll start just by asking our great group of panelists here to introduce themselves. Maybe Marc, PCCW event today. Why don't you get started?
My name is Marc Halbfinger. Thanks, Kevin. It's good to see you as always. I manage PCCW Global. I should be careful. You mentioned about being careful with the marketing guys. PCCW Global is a unit of HKT, which itself is majority owned by PCCW Group. And so I'm two steps down from PCCW. So I just want to be cautious about the nomenclature. And we operate a global transmission network and IP backbone. Over the last few years, we've evolved our automated fabric, which we refer to as Console Connect, and hopefully we'll have a chance to discuss all that.
Excellent. We have another Marc with us as well.
Yes, thanks, Kevin. Marc Middleton here. So it's a pleasure to be here. It's nice to meet the other panelists as well. I'm currently the CTO of ActivePort Group Limited. We're an Australian-based company. And we write an SDN or a software-defined orchestration platform, which we call ActivePortal. And hopefully we'll have a bit of a discussion around the topic points today.
Cool. How about Murad?
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Kevin and Marc. Great to see you. My name is Murad Kaplan. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Stateless. We're a Boulder-based startup. And what do? We build a software that allows enterprise to connect to multiple cloud in a very seamless way, specifically with, as we're going to talk today, like the multi-hybrid cloud. It's become very, very challenging managing different clouds, but also different data centers and connecting all of that together. And automation was one of the biggest problems here. So we solved this problem by providing a software that automates the entire process of connectivity. Our customers / partners are companies like PCCW, data centers, network service providers, that they can use our software to their internal usage, but also they can offer it as a service to their customers, the enterprise. And we also target the enterprise as well. So that's Stateless.
Okay, cool. And Amit, finally.
Hi, my name is Amit Naik. I lead product marketing for network services products at Cloudflare. Cloudflare, as many of you might know, is a network and security services provider for a lot of web applications and enterprises globally. And we partner with PCCW as well. So thank you for having me, Kevin.
Excellent. So Marc, Marc Halbfinger, looks like you brought a good component of your
I just want to be clear. I didn't even know
ecosystem here
these. I didn't
today.
even know these guys were going to be here. Okay, I just. But I am excited to discover that we have some sort of relationship at the technology layer, generally driven by an API between and among each of the players here, and hopefully we're meaningful to them in the same way that we believe each of them is meaningful to us. And our view is that the ICT community, as you know, Kevin, you and I have spoken about this for years. The ICT community is becoming increasingly complex, and here it is, non-standard folks talking to each other about moving data around for enterprises and service providers, which arguably would have been more complex, and everyone is focused on security and automation. I think it's wonderful.
And so, just to build on that, Marc, what have you seen lately in the last couple of years in terms of enterprise trending for automation? Is it something that's just expected? Are they asking for anything in particular? Is it accelerating? Just what's your kind of macro view of what your customer base is saying to you?
I think that first and foremost, it's obvious that cloud-based applications are driving behavioral change amongst enterprises, no matter what the size. Enterprises are leveraging cloud in order to get to transformational applications that help change their business. And those applications can be CRM, they can be ERP, they can be HR, they can be UCaaS, they can be security as Cloudflare delivers. And how data is moved is becoming increasingly complex. I think that Marc at Stateless is probably the expert on the panel on the specifics of how data moves around from enterprise and so on. And Marc at ActivePort is doing very similar work in trying to manage different hybrid loads that take place across it. Each one of them brings a different expertise to the table, which is exciting for us to interface with. And all of them, I think, are bringing to bear the fact that clouds have shifted the way enterprise think about how to get what they need in assuring their own connectivity requirements, in assuring their own applications, and ensuring their security, and in building out communities of usage in their verticals or through their developer relationships as the applications become more sophisticated. And when we acquired Console Connect in 2017, or as I regularly say to my people, as Console Connect emotionally, culturally, and mentally acquired PCCW Global, we decided to shift the mindset about what are the priorities, and to make sure that we were solving problems that enterprises have with code, as opposed to with physical connectivity. And I think if there's a commonality of the four of us on the panel right now, it's that we approach the enterprises with solutions that simplify and automate using code, and at the same time trying to deliver different forms of QoS or security layers that facilitates that value set to the enterprise. And I think that's what the enterprise is looking for. They're looking for simplicity. They're looking for the ability to integrate multiple applications, multiple platforms, whether they be clouds, networks, or other types of security-based infrastructures. And they're looking to do so commercially on an on-demand basis. In other words, they don't want to be paying long-term contracts or licensing arrangements if they're consistently shifting what the value sets that are driving. They want to be able to achieve a value for what they require at the moment that they use it, and then move on. And I think that all of these are areas that we're focused upon. So in a very short answer to your question, I would say that the physical network is becoming less important to the enterprise as the primary point of access, and rather what is more important to the enterprise today is the application. And therefore it's incumbent upon those that are in the service provision layer to assure that they're delivering those application values as seamlessly as possible, and to recognize where they sit in the value chain.
Interesting. I guess the assumption is that the underlying network is going to be there, right? It's important, but not as important. It's assumed to be available. Gentlemen, anything to add?
I'll just come back to that quickly. They want the network, they want QoS, they want security. And in that regard, the network is important, but it's presumed.
It's
You have to bear in
presumed-
mind that the commercial relationship that a network provider has with an enterprise is going to be different than the commercial relationship that an application has or that a cloud has. And how do you align all of those? That's the challenge. Sorry.
No worries. Gentlemen, anything to add? Anything specific that you're seeing that maybe Marc hasn't touched on? Just open the floor here.
Sure, I'm happy to add on here. So I think what's happening recently, there is like two domains happening in the industry. You have the cloud represented by the large hyperscalers, and then you have the traditional networks. And as we saw in the past 5 years, the gap between these two started like getting smaller and smaller, and that's create opportunities and create challenges in terms of like three trends happening right now, which is creating a challenge for the networking specifically. The first trend we see is the changing user persona in the enterprise. We see less of the traditional network engineers, the Cisco certified engineers, and more of the DevOps and the data engineers. You can see it even if you look, do any simple research on human resource and the employment, and there is like a big shift. Even we see that in universities now. We have a great engagement with some universities local here, and we see some of the departments are having a struggle with the traditional kind of network engineers, for example, skills and demand. So what does that mean is now you start dealing with this new persona that is more cloud focused, is more onto the as a service, but they don't have much of experience in networking and engineering that. So that there is a struggle there, because they don't have the skills. The second trend we see, Marc mentioned applications. We see not only new applications, but the frequency of adding a new application is increasing. Now, an enterprise, when they come to the networking, usually the approach is they set up a network and they don't touch it for a year, maybe a few years, because it's just an application. They want to connect, for example, SD-WAN with some encryption, with some firewalling, and then that's it. It doesn't work this today. The frequency is happening because you have different teams, DevOps and data engineers, I just mentioned, they need different connectivity to multiple clouds, more frequency because they want to do testing, automation, and so they are going back to the network engineers who was like reducing their numbers, shrinking. They say, open a port for me, open a connection for me. So the frequency is increasing, and that's also put more pressure on automation for networking without impacting security and efficiency. And then the last trend also we're seeing is the scalability. The scalability, not just in terms of numbers of connection, but again, as Marc mentioned, the number of endpoints. Because today you're not just connecting client server, which is the traditional networking, you're connecting a service to service, endpoint to endpoint. And this service can be tenants, can be applications, can be IoT, Internet of Things, or can be anything, So it's like the scale is going like to the roof. And that put a lot of pressure on the network that needs to keep up and scale with that. And our belief is the physical aspect of the network can only do much. And that's where the software comes in. The software comes in terms of the automation, the abstraction of complexity, and also the scale here. So that's kind of like our view when we start like going to this market and we start seeing, as I mentioned earlier, we start engaging with the data centers and the network service provider, and also engaging with the enterprise and the cloud, we start seeing these trends and the gap between these two domains.
So all of these trends and issues and so on create quite a complex need to build the solutions required to deliver against those requirements. I know that just from a MEF perspective, earlier this year we did 7 proof of concept virtual showcases against some pretty sophisticated use cases. And the number of different suppliers and components, services that had to be chained together and orchestrated and whatnot was daunting. And it's a challenge to do this within a single provider environment versus let alone across an entire ecosystem that's global in nature. Maybe Marc Middleton, maybe you can talk about or tell us your thoughts on, what are the big challenges you're seeing? You formed a partnership, for example, with PCCW Global. You have others. What are you seeing out there in terms of the challenges to pull all this together and so on?
Yeah, it's a good point, and I think I'd like to, carry forward what was mentioned before, which is really end-to-end orchestration. What we're seeing and what we're trying to focus on with our orchestration tool is really providing that simplicity through a single pane of glass. Because what you're starting to come into is orchestration that might be, applications at the cloud level. It might be network integration at the cloud level. You'd be dealing with, a range of ecosystems, including Console Connect, and you need to orchestrate with them, and they may be used to do some of that cloud network orchestration. But then you may have to deal with carriers. So it comes down into how do you interface with those carriers at an API level to potentially get services delivered to different parts of the world. You have to do orchestration of components within the data center. You have to orchestrate the component to get it out to the edge device. And we started a lot of our orchestration at the edge. And managing edge devices, because by the last mile has tended to be quite a complex issue. And so we focused on that first, and sort of then went from the edge device back into the data center and into orchestration of cloud providers. But from an enterprise perspective, it's really the simplicity of doing the full end-to-end orchestration piece. So instead of going to 15 consoles through all different vendors, people are now wanting to go to one place and orchestrate and touch, dozens of different touch points across different networks, different applications, different entry points into what they're trying to deliver. And so from our perspective, we've tried to build an orchestrator that allows the simplicity and touching all those points, ultimately getting that service or whatever they may be using delivered out to the edge device and then configuration of the edge device.
You brought up orchestration with the telcos and APIs, and the solution to that is very simple. You just use MEF APIs. We've spent a whole time defining them. I have to make the pitch here, of course.
Yeah, that would be an ideal world situation, wouldn't it? But it's an interesting point. We deal with dozens and dozens of APIs through different vendors, and it'd be very convenient to have an open standard API that you can interface with. And I think we're going to get there at some point, but today, a lot of the vendors are still holding on to their legacy APIs, as a value proposition.
I'll pipe in a little bit later in terms of the desire to see standardized enterprise and APIs that we're seeing that and grow. Amit, any thoughts on this whole kind of notion of how do we bring this whole ecosystem together and automate across it?
Yeah, so if you look at the different lanes of the networking world, right, we've had different levels of automation and orchestration and programmability in different domains, right? In the MEF world, for example, we have a set of API that allow us to do X. In the internet world, we have a significant amount of automation and awareness, self-awareness, right, that allows us to do Y. The challenge as an industry for all of us is bringing all of these together so we can offer the end-to-end programmability that our customers are looking for, right? So we've all heard of network as a service, but really the idea behind network as a service is how do you get connectivity between your sites, between your applications, between your users? Because ultimately what all of this is coming from is this desire for, it's what I call consumerization of IT, right? Users want their apps to be extremely fluid and extremely responsive. And for a long time, we've lived, we've had two different parallel worlds, right? We've had the application world that treats networks as just plumbing, just to move data around. And we've had the network and telco world that treats applications as just packets and bits and data, right? And I think we've seen attempts to bring the two together, but ultimately what it's about is providing that fluid user experience, right? And the programmability that gets us there. And one of the challenges in sort of architecting these services is how do you layer on all the other services that you need, right? Kevin, you alluded to the service chaining problem earlier when you mentioned your POCs. There's a lot of other components you need to layer on to networks, including security. That's a big one, right? And very often security requirements constrain our architecture, constrain the programmability. And we're working to sort of build services where that's no longer the case, where you can provision a security service to an API just as easily as you can provision connectivity.
Yeah, that's a topic that's kind of near and dear to everybody's heart. So, and Marc Halbfinger, we've had many discussions over the years about, forward-looking discussions about the work that the industry has to do, where collaboration has to take place, and obviously you have a console offering that was designed to solve some of these problems and deliver a certain experience to enterprise with an ecosystem behind you. If you look at this sort of big picture, because you're a big picture guy, you look at that big picture of where the industry is at. How far along is console in that journey, in terms of reaching the sort of utopian global automation state, if you want to call it that?
Well, we have more. Thanks, Kevin, for the softball pitch. I'll say that first of all, it's very impressive to hear Murad, Marc, and Amit each talk about the issues facing us from slightly different vectors in the ecosystem, but all of them really quite intelligent, and I would argue very far down the road in understanding that the complexity that we have today in the ICT space is going to be solved by strong code development and making sure that that code is presented to end users in the most simple form. And to see that each of them is working with Console Connect in different ways, generally bilaterally also. I don't think that there's a customer supplier relationship here. It's not a hierarchical relationship, but rather it's a relationship of equals that we've established is exciting. If a user wants to immediately access Cloudflare in order to tackle an anti-DDoS problem, just to drop in on Amit's most immediate use case, and Amit will kick me under the virtual table if I get this wrong. But arguably, if there's a user, even Marc on ActivePort, if he has ports on Console Connect and he can access Cloudflare, and all of a sudden, for whatever reason, he's going to be getting hit with a DDoS issue, he can spin up to Cloudflare over Console in a moment, in a minute, and move traffic off. Cloudflare can solve for that problem, and then they can shut down the relationship between them. So I think that the most exciting thing that Console Connect is providing today is the any-to-any relationship. In another way, Murad and Stateless is doing the same, and the API that we have between us there, I think, enhances each other's relationships with the end users to some extent. And so each of us here, by working together, is able to provide value to end users. Those end users can be service provider channels, they can be applications, or they can be direct enterprises. And I think the key now is making sure that users get to a port and they understand that a port can be used for more than just an A to Z connection, as used to be the case in the connection world. You can now get to an application-based anti-DDoS relationship. You can get to multi-cloud hybrid environment. You can be doing ERP relationship. You can be doing any-to-any in your vertical. If it's an airline that wants to get to the engine manufacturer, or to the airport, or to the catering facility that delivers to that airport, whatever, with some sort of connection, they can spin up those relationships any-to-any within their vertical at any time. And additionally, the developer communities that are around ActivePort, that are around Cloudflare, that are around Stateless, will also be able to interface with the applications and with the rest of the developer communities on an on-demand basis. And so from my point of view, the next, from the technical interface and automation, I think that we've done an enormous amount in Console Connect, importantly by creating that any-to-any relationship. Obviously, the direct connect to cloud, which is quite critical to automate that interface, where we're not the only one on the street who have done that, but I think it's quite important to see how well distributed we are globally in so many zones, because that comes to the latency and quality issues that we alluded to at the beginning. And then the next part, obviously, is many of these applications, they would prefer not to go over the internet. We facilitate that. And at the same time, some would want to get to the internet. We facilitate internet access on an automated basis. So far, no one out there on the street today has automated wholesale or enterprise IP. We've done that, and I think that that's meaningful for those users who want it. Although most of the applications that we're talking about here on the panel thus far, to some extent, reference bypassing the internet environment in order to get to cloud and the applications that are there. And so then to answer your question about what's next, is we've got this automated technical environment. We've done a good amount in terms of creating the units of value that can be sold on an on-demand basis for users. So for instance, the user can spin up an on-demand internet connection for as little as a day. even though technically we can do it even for less, but we've offered it up from a commercial point of view for a minimum of the day. So too, we can do an any-to-any connection for as little as an hour or even less if we wanted to. But the key, I think, will be to, and you and I, Kevin, have spoken about it privately many times. I'll just say it openly now in the public. I think the next step is to create an automation around the commercial interfaces. The APIs are really solid for the technical interface, but there's going to have to be another module out there. And I'm of the view that distributed ledger might be one of the approaches in order to do that will facilitate the automation of settlement upstream and downstream in this complicated food chain that we've described here. And I think that's the next stage that we're working on. I'm very excited to see MEF going forward with some thoughts around that in the commercial attributes department around distributed ledger, and maybe you'll throw out a commercial for MEF in that regard if you want. But that's certainly one of the next areas that we are focusing on to leverage distributed ledger to augment the technical interfaces that we've described here that are available on automation. To use distributed ledger in order to deal with three elements. One is identity, the other is inventory, and the last is settlement. And I think that's the next step from our point of view. And I hope that others in the industry, and certainly like-minded thinking individuals from Cloudflare, Stateless, and ActivePort, hopefully they'll come along for the ride.
Yeah, I'll ask the other gentleman to pipe in. You know, from our perspective, just on the DLT front, there seems to be pockets of activity that are not really well connected yet. Bilateral things going on between carriers and so on that front. And we're starting to become more aware of what are the different initiatives. And in parallel with that, we've got the standardization, the architecture is happening, but I don't think it's all come together yet. And I know, Marc, we've worked together on that with initiatives like C-band and so on, and Global Leaders Forum. I guess the big question is just how long is that going to take? The companies that are forward looking, sometimes we expect things to happen quickly, but it could take many, many years for it to really become a reality. I mean, if you look at just the API work, we started doing API work and MEF standardization about 5 years ago. And now we're only hitting the inflection point now of industry adoption, heavy lifting to pull it all together. But gentlemen, what are your thoughts on the topic, building on the initial question that I asked Marc about where are we in the journey here?
I'm happy to kind of continue on what Marc is saying. I'm glad that Marc mentioned the commercial aspect of the automation, because one of the things that we notice is there is a lot of focus on the technical side, which is great, but there is dismissive or not paying attention to the commercial aspect. I will look at it more into the business model, the financial model. Going back to what I said earlier, the gap between these two domains. That's one of the biggest gaps between the traditional network vendors, suppliers, technologists, and the cloud. If you look at the cloud, what's their business model is the as a service. Almost everything is a consumption-based model. Multi-tenancy, you just use a service for a few minutes, few hours based on your user, and then you shut it down, and then you don't have to pay for it. The networking, and that's include the service providers and that domain, again, because as Amit mentioned, it's a plumbing, so so you just put it and you don't use it. So the business model is usually in that is a long-term investment. So they expect their customers to pay for a few years contract, and then because they don't expect it to change. Now, the problem is when you combine or close the gap between these two domains, the enterprise, one of the challenges they have, not only automating how do they use the service, is also automating and also having a single pane of glass of the payment model. One of the issues now we are facing with the multiple data centers, their CFO office, they panic when we mention to them consumption-based model service. And we say like, hey, why can't you charge your user based on their usage? And they're like, well, how do we gonna plan for that? How are we gonna put the financials? We're not used to that. So basically we have like two main issues when it comes to the commercial challenge here. You got the technology gap. A lot of the traditional networking technologies are not designed for the consumption-based model. That's why their business model is based on license. You pay for multiple years for that. So that's something we need to kind of solve, and there's a lot of solutions around that to turn it to be more as a service and multi-tenancy. And then the second thing, which is I think is the hardest, is the culture change here. With a lot of the network vendors and network technologists, is they build the entire organization in a different business model that, in our opinion, it does not match what the cloud is all about, you know. So these are the two main things. I think the technology part is, I think, the easiest. There is a lot of ways of making it as a service, but as long as the network service provider, they still hold off on the old ways of doing business, it's going to be challenges. So they need to have a wake-up call, do a lot of thinking and strategy planning on how they change their business model and the financials to close the gap and be more closer to this kind of cloud ecosystem here.
It's sort of
you raised a very good point here, right? So if you look at what the public cloud folks are doing, right? They've already transitioned network to a service model, right? And networks, unfortunately, were the last things to shift to that model, and it's a little bit slower than we all hope for. But if you look at the way application developers are sort of running networks, building infrastructure within public cloud environments, I think that's a pretty good sign of what's to come and the expectations and the cultural shifts that are happening in the industry, right? And we're going to see that that push down over time to physical networks as well that connect us over large distances, not just public cloud environments. So I think all of us that are helping make that happen, I think we just need to work together to accelerate this transformation.
I just sure, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just gonna add to those points, because there was some very valid points that were there, and tying the API discussion back, what we've seen and the work that we've been doing really revolves around the carrier and the telco market. What we've seen, and I might be preempting something here, but many of the carriers themselves, or the telcos, have come into an era now where they've got eroding primary business happening in terms of their typical carriage, but many carriers didn't adopt APIs quickly enough. So you're getting ecosystem partners that have overtaken many of the traditional carrier models, and so the carriers are sitting there with eroding margins, potentially losing out their traditional businesses to ecosystem partners. As was mentioned there with Amit, that the cloud partners have definitely grabbed hold of the consumption model, but the carriers haven't adopted that. Their traditional market has been, let's sell a point-to-point link. And when you do that, and if you try to move that into a consumption model, it's a very, very difficult thing, particularly when you've got erosion in their traditional market. And so we've seen a lot of that, and I guess SD-WAN has been a factor of that erosion as well. When they're not typically selling a Metro Ethernet service, and now it's going down to maybe an internet link, and so they're in this catch-up phase, I suspect, to sort of catch up to companies like Console Connect in what they're doing, and really APIs will help drive that. So they've got to be quicker to market with that.
Yeah, just offer a MEF perspective. We're kind of in the middle of a pretty large carrier community. We have a couple hundred member companies, 130 carriers, and so we're pretty tuned into where these various players are along the journey. A few points. One is it is interesting to see players like Console, who are very forward-looking. They were ahead of the standards, so they were implementing, let's say, proprietary APIs because the standards weren't available, but they're also a great example of using the standards as they become available to facilitate the growth of their business and interconnection with the other carriers and so on that are connected to today, for example. What we're seeing though, MEF, our initial API plans were really focused on inter-carrier automation of connectivity services, initially Ethernet. But there's a couple of interesting trends there. Number one is, as we've evolved this is a technical thing, and I'm not a technical guy, but as we've evolved that API program, the real opportunity is to be able to conduct business across a whole range of services. They don't have to be connectivity services. They can be security services being bought and sold, et cetera, et cetera. So these things are becoming a little bit more what we call payload independent. And that's improving the business viability, the business case for a carrier to actually invest, because it's not just wholesale Ethernet services being used for our work. The other point, though, where we're going to see, we should see an acceleration of the implementation of the APIs is what we were talking about on the enterprise side. And some of the carriers will tell us, our members, like, it's great that we're automating on the back end within the sort of wholesale environment. That's very important to deliver globally and last mile and all that stuff. But when we see enterprise demand, when we see customers that want to buy not just Ethernet, they're putting a global SD-WAN network in place. They need to buy IP, internet access services. They need security, all of the different components, edge type compute services. Then the whole value of a standard suite of APIs and the business case to invest in those changes. And that's the shift that we've seen kind of quite quickly. And as we've investigated what's kind of there for that from an enterprise perspective, enterprise-facing perspective with respect to APIs, there's no standards. And the beauty of what we've done is that what we built for wholesale purposes is quite portable to the enterprise. The challenge we have is getting that word out, because we're an organization that's doing standardization. We're known for playing in a certain space, and now we have to create a broader awareness, including enterprise awareness, which is it's no small challenge. The other, just to reflect what you guys are saying in terms of the players and so on, we're seeing a pretty substantial shift in terms of the composition of our membership. We're seeing all sorts of interesting players come into the membership, edge players, more security players, more orchestration platform players, and so on. So that's a positive thing to bring it all together, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to be a place that can help bring this community together, which is not a trivial thing when you have a lot of different business interests, a lot of competition going out there. Not everybody likes collaboration. Not everybody likes standards. Some people think it's a dirty word. And so I think we're sort of seeing everything you folks are seeing. And trying to navigate ourselves to help. The one thing that we've discussed quite extensively at our board level of MEF is, we're talking about delivering solutions to enterprises and what the service providers need to do to stay relevant and so on. But the enterprise environment is pretty messy in some ways. If you think about the vendors that have become MSPs, the numerous, that are now selling direct to enterprise, they're selling particular solutions to meet a particular need. They're not trying to do what a more traditional service provider would do to their customer in terms of providing a full suite of connectivity to their services, wireless, you name it. You have numerous security companies that are really not even dealing with the service providers. They're dealing directly with enterprises. So if you're an enterprise, it must be challenging. These are challenging times to figure out where the service provider fits versus getting these leading, some of the solutions that a pure play vendor can deliver immediately to a service provider will probably always be more advanced than what the service provider can deliver, because of the, they don't need to scale it per se, and they don't need to integrate it and offer it as a comprehensive offering. And so look, that's maybe a bit of a verbose way of leading into the next topic, but maybe Marc Halbfinger, what are your thoughts on kind of the MSP world, how it competes with you, any trends you're seeing in that regard, challenges?
I think, Murad hit the nail on the head when he said that there are these three trends, and one of them that was dramatic was to say the network-based engineer is sort of still important, but taking on an adjacency role to the guys that are doing DevOps and bringing the applications forward. And I think that Amit really laid it out well when he organized how the industry is now stratifying itself. When I say the industry, it's not and Kevin, you've referenced a few times the word the carrier. The carrier, I said at the outset of my remarks, and bear in mind, I have two hats. I got the PCCW Global logo over there, and I've got the Console Connect logo over here. And that PCCW Global logo is generally representing a physical network, and the Console Connect logo is representing a really dramatically moving code-based platform. And that platform, the revenue growth and the user growth and so on, which is developing itself without salespeople. It's just happening online, and it's doing so because we publish Cloudflare, we publish ActivePort, we publish Stateless, and they publish apps. If you go into the Cloudflare blogs, you'll see that if you want to get access to Cloudflare at Zone this or Zone that, you can do it through Console Connect or through one of the Console Connect platform competitors. And that's really the way to move forward. And you alluded to it, Kevin, when you said the industry, and I guess you meant the carriers, there need to find ways to go beyond their comfort zone. I've been advocating for some years that we refer to it not as the carrier industry, but rather as the ICT industry, that is providing various forms of applications, infrastructure as a service, network as a service, applications as a service, whatever that may be, for exactly what you said, that enterprise. I don't think that the enterprise is feeling complicated. I think the enterprise is moving at very advanced speed now. By the way, long after the consumer, right? The consumer driver was social media and the smartphone. And all of a sudden, consumer blew up. And then enterprise applications and all this finally showed up 7 or 8 years later, driven by cloud. And I think that we're seeing that now. And so it's necessary for anyone that's out there who wants to provide a service. And let's not categorize them if it's a cloud, an ICP, an MSP, a carrier, an application. I would say that anyone that wants to be providing, and Marc explained it well, an any end-to-end service for an end user, in this instance an enterprise, really needs to think conceptually about all of the components. When we talk about infrastructure, we can talk about the physical network that may or may not be owned by a carrier, whether wireless or fixed. We can talk about a cloud, and Marc is expert at explaining why multi-cloud is necessary. So too can Console Connect facilitate. And actually, I think ActivePort works with Console Connect to some extent to facilitate that multi-cloud environment to the end user. And then the data center. The key is the on-ramp and off-ramps at the data centers. Those are the physical locations where enterprises are getting to. But interestingly, most data centers today, the vast amount of data center occupation is with the clouds and not with the enterprise. I think we're at early stages in data center development where enterprises will be leveraging that capability, and they'll be going to what is now being referred to as edge data centers. And the applications associated with that will be quite unique. Around that, there's a vast amount of key applications. I mentioned them earlier around ERP, CRM, security, UCaaS, and whatever, but there's going to be many more, and there already are. And the question is, how do we create the opportunities for the end user to ubiquitously use whatever they require across that ICT front, and recognize, as Murad said, that the enterprise decision maker, the one who is involved in procurement and development to facilitate simplicity for their end user, is focused less on network engineering and more on the seamlessness and utility of the application. That really has to be the driver. And I applaud MEF for its ability to think through that change. And I think you're right that there's probably too much fragmentation amongst those who are creating and facilitating common standards, or what I would prefer to refer to as a common information model, which arguably should perhaps be evolved through this complex ICT environment. And it may make sense to find greater cooperation amongst MEF, TM Forum, GSMA, IETF, CBAN, whoever those entities may be. And I hope that the MEF board would be willing to get out of its comfort zones the same way that the colleagues on the panel have already done in order to help facilitate. That's my speech on that one. But, you know, and I apologize if I spoke too long. Maybe Amit or Marc think differently, and I'm certainly happy to be challenged on this one.
Let's have a challenge. Any thoughts, gentlemen?
I agree with a lot of what you said here, right? So you alluded in the beginning to this organic shift that's happening, the culture, and Murad alluded to this as well, the culture shift that's happening where developers and application developers, they're thinking of infrastructure as code, right? Just very naturally. They're not coming at it from a network world, and they're building all these dynamic infrastructures when as needed to run their application. And that's driving a lot of change. And that's creating the pull, if you will, in the market to get us all to shift. The other problem that, like you alluded to, is sort of There are software stacks and there's orchestration stacks that help developers do this, right? The public cloud is a great example of this. They made it easy to automate networks, but until very recently, they didn't have their own networks, right? They were relying on the public internet. They were relying on the customer to figure out their own networking, right? And only recently we've started seeing them invest in the infrastructure, invest in the capacity. So the challenge for us as an industry is how do we bring these two worlds together, right? The orchestration world and the infrastructure world, and deliver these services to our customers. So it's easy for enterprises to make that transformation themselves as well.
Any thoughts, gentlemen?
No, well, I totally agree with that. And you know, Marc made the comment about, you know, the data center and how important that's becoming in the whole end-to-end service delivery. And that's absolutely right. And I think today, you know, we explained that, you know, the data center today is like the telephone exchange as it was in the past. You sort of, your last mile connection into the data center is now becoming an ability to dial in services and get access to those services as you could when you could pick up a phone and potentially dial into other locations in the old concept of an exchange. Still, some of the challenges we have is still very much the last mile. You know, a lot of the ecosystem partners and the way that we work tend to deliver services in the data center, and so that last mile challenge is still a very, very important aspect. We've got to get the customer from where they are in their head office or their remote office into the data center to start consuming those services.
And on that topic, on that note, last mile, obviously SD-WAN is driving, you know, the need for quality internet access of one shape or form. And, you know, there's a debate depending on the applications, whether the internet is really good enough or do we need a more sophisticated IP underlay. Are there any trends? I'll just open the floor to whoever would like to chime in here. Are there trends that you're seeing in one direction or the other there? With respect to enterprise thoughts in that area?
And the one thing we all talk about a lot these days is the internet the new corporate network, right? We've been, for the last 18 months, we've all been living our lives on it. We've been working on it. Our kids have been learning on it. And we've become more and more dependent and reliant on the internet, right? The challenge is the internet, the way it was designed and architected, it was designed to be automated and resilient, but it was not designed particularly with security in mind, right? Its job was to connect A and B any way possible. So some of the enterprise requirements like security were not taken into account. It's also, in the good day, you know, we engineer a lot of availability into internet services. And the good day, everything works, right? It's great, but is it reliable enough and dependable enough to run a mission critical business on top of, right? And that's always been the challenge with the internet. That's one of the areas Cloudflare has invested a lot in over the years. In fact, if you look at our mission statements, we're helping build a better internet because it's more and more relevant to enterprises today than ever before. And we're helping solve some of the security challenges, some of the reliability challenges, some of the performance challenges that we see on the internet, right? One of the biggest challenges is, you know, as application performance, like apps and users need to get closer to each other, right? And networks have to evolve and spread out and move closer to the edge, but not just networks, workloads need to go out and move closer to the edge because in some cases, we're running into some fundamental limits of physics here, right? How fast light can travel. And you know, we're continuously investing and optimizing a network to be closer to every eyeball on the planet, if you will, right? So right now we're at about 50 milliseconds of about 95% of the world's population of the internet. But these are some of the optimizations we've been making over the last several years. But also helping enterprises access the internet in a safe, reliable way and a performant way as well.
One of just a little plug, and I'll let the others chime in here. A little plug for what we're doing here at MEF is to facilitate the automated acquisition of internet access services to fulfill ultimately global enterprise demands. We're standardizing what an internet access looks like. And
Well, Kevin, I invite you to log on to Console Connect because you can get an automated interconnection right now. Hopefully you'll standardize along those lines.
that's right. Well, your folks are involved, and that's an example of, you were ahead of the standards, but the intent here is to, if we can standardize what the internet access, the different attributes of the service and so on, then the automation from a retail provider to a wholesale provider might be facilitated if there's some sort of standardization of the service that's being bought. It's not going to do anything with respect to controlling the quality, the ultimate quality of that service, but there is a huge demand, and the wholesale trends that we're seeing is carrier Ethernet as an underlay is sort of stagnant, and IP, internet access from a commercial perspective is growing, considerably, and that's kind of across the board. Maybe we'll just, we're probably getting close enough to the end of things here. Maybe I'll just ask all of you to, provide some closing thoughts on the topic today, and we can have a bit of a discussion on that too. Maybe Marc Middleton, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, well, maybe I can just close off on the internet. I think you raise a very good point. We need to define what the internet is, because you can do the internet largely just because you get a public IP address delivered to an edge device doesn't necessarily mean you're on the internet. Your local loop could be going through an ISP, and they may own their own network. So the internet for a local loop could be very viable, because the internet really doesn't come into play until you leave the ISP's border router and they pass it off out of their network. So local loop could be very good, and at that point, when it leaves the ISP and transverses out of their network into others, back to Amit's point, is that yes, it can be unreliable. There may be other problems, particularly in different regions around the world, and this is where Console Connect can come into play, where you can transition from a reasonably stable local loop and then put it into a terrestrial service through Console Connect, and then pass that from country to country where you're not transitioning the internet. So I think the internet boundary and your work that MEF will do there will be vital in really determining what is the internet. And just because we have internet at home doesn't necessarily mean we're actually past the internet until at some point in the future, whether that happens at the data center or somewhere else.
Right. How about Murad? Your thoughts?
Sorry, I was muted. My kids were going crazy. I decided to go crazy in the past 5 minutes. Now, I would like to kind of continue on what Marc said about what is the internet now? Going back to the point that we see a change of the entire industry in the world, the dynamic. That's also mean that the internet, by definition, starts changes as we see now. The internet, as Amit said, traditionally was designed to connect point A to point B, and then that's pretty much it. The challenge we see today that point A and point B are now moving. Traditionally it was you have one location data center and then one edge, then you connect them. So you know the IP address, you know the geographical location. So you build your path, the internet designed that, and then that's it. But now one of the things we're seeing is with the cloud, the internet is not just expanding on the physical aspect, but also within the cloud. AWS and Azure are expanding dramatically on the application. To give you an example, one of the things now we're seeing, if you look at the new upcoming data services like Snowflake and Databricks, so talking about the last mile is not just on the edge and the data center, but also the last mile to accessing that service within the cloud. And one of the things about the dynamic nature we see today is, let's say that you connect your office to that Snowflake service in AWS East, but then you decided for whatever reason that you want to change it to AWS West because it's better performance. You want to be have a better service provider there. So now the internet is changing. You have to be very dynamic and moving that, and you want to have the flexibility to make these changes and not allowing the network / the internet to be constrained with you. So it's a very, very interesting aspect. It's going back to there is a need to look at that from a technical perspective, how the internet protocols or routing protocols need to be designed in a way that also very close to the applications on top of them. So they work hand in hand. If the application requirement change, the network / the internet can be adaptive and change accordingly for that.
Of course. Amit.
So I think we're living in a very exciting time for networks right now. There's a lot of organic pull from developers from the industry that for thinking of infrastructure as code. And at the same time, there's a lot of great work going on in the standards bodies such as MEF and helping bring together all the different worlds, right, through a collaborative ecosystem of APIs. We have a lot of work to do, no doubt, but I think we're moving in the right direction, moving to a consumption model for networks, like Marc alluded to, right, and trying to make it more dynamic as possible. We just need to figure out a few things, like how do we chain additional services into this picture? How do we address the financial aspects and the commercial aspects of this as well?
Well said. One of the comments that one of the executives made on a MEF virtual event series over the last year, he said, networking is cool again, which was kind of an interesting statement. Marc, maybe your parting thoughts, and then I'll throw a couple of words in on behalf of MEF.
Listen, first of all, I should just say that we're honored to sponsor something for PTC. We're honored to continuously sponsor things for MEF because we think both organizations do important stuff for our industry. And I just wanted to highlight, I want to thank you, Kevin, Bashan, and also all of the colleagues at PTC in that regard. And I wanted, most importantly, to thank the fact that the three colleagues here on the panel were willing to collaborate with me and with you in order to discuss, because to see a willingness of a company like Stateless that's developing cutting edge and active port that's doing some really dramatic work in multi-cloud and Cloudflare, who building a business which is growing year on year at such an unbelievable pace, and that the markets are rewarding with forward thought valuations. And that all three of them believe that working with Console Connect is meaningful for their end user base. For us, I think is a validation of the roadmap, that when we said that it would be important that we be the only network with a platform and the only platform with a network. And that network is globally deployed, so that if you take the use case that Murad just described about moving, let's say, from AWS Zone X to AWS Zone Y, you can literally do that with the click of a button in terms of where we're at. And I think that that's meaningful to Cloudflare, it's meaningful to Stateless, it's meaningful to ActivePort, that we're able to deliver both an enterprise layer and a wholesale layer QoS capability that facilitates both automated platform and the valuable physical components of network. I don't think that we should lose sight of the fact about how important it is for the industry to find common language and to recognize that interoperability should no longer be just in segments, data centers to data centers, networks to networks, applications to applications. Actually, we need to really break down the boundaries as much as possible in and among the different functional components of the ICT industry. And I've been advocating this for a while, Kevin, together with you privately, to have a panel here that's a network, that's an application, that's a body of code, and all of us able to talk around common language in order to work through what are the format structures and commercial imperatives of interoperability. Much, much different than where we were having this conversation, let's say 15 years ago, for bilaterals amongst physical service providers. And I think we need to accelerate that discussion, figure out what are the commonalities, find out how quickly we can deliver value to one another through that form of API-based or distributed ledger-based interoperability, or both, in order to drive more and more meaningful usage for end users. And that's really our mantra.
It's a good lead into a few parting words on my part here. You mentioned the MEF board and being challenged to come outside of the MEF to move outside the comfort zone, and that's been a pretty interesting journey. We were well known for having built what is around an $80 billion annual carrier Ethernet industry. And Marc, you've repeated many times that MEF did a good job of bringing the vendors and the service providers together to create a set of standards that benefited everybody, including the enterprises and so on and so forth. And that was the starting point. And then from there, we said, let's take that and let's expand that to look at automation of those services. And that took us into the automation space, but it was still within the carrier community. And then if you have that type of framework, well, we can standardize other types of connectivity and now security services. So now you're moving up the stack from a value perspective, service perspective. So those are a couple of dimensions, but if you look at the big problem that's being discussed or the challenges that are being discussed here, it's not just the technology vendors and the service providers, carriers, call them whatever you want, that we're working with. We're now extending into the hyperscalers. We're extending into different types of service providers that that are playing in the network as a service game and elsewhere, and then of course to the enterprise. And so on one hand, the challenge is the opportunity is huge. On the other hand, you have to make sure you're not trying to boil the ocean as an organization like us. And that drives the discussion about, what are the key collaborations? What are the key partners you need in the standards world? What are the constituents you need in your membership to make it all happen? So we're trying to find that balance, be moving forward to meet the demands, bring the right players to the table, but certainly not reinvent the wheel in terms of what others are doing and working with the right players. But those are MEF's parting thoughts. Listen, it's been a pleasure to host a panel of very forward-looking companies and gentlemen. And I thank you for the time. We look forward to maybe doing this again sometime. And Marc, thanks to PCCW and yourself for asking me to participate today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.